I barely know what I'm going to talk about. And, usually I would come with a lot of pictures and slides of our own work. It's not like that today. I wanted to give a relatively short talk, introduction, and try to entice you into speculating about some of the things that I find difficult to solve, especially in light of what I've understood in my ignorant way of Steiner's philosophy. And to start by saying that even before reading much about Steiner, I think, and I was talking to Richard about this, sort of imbibed a couple of really big ideas in a way that I don't really fully understand how they settled into my understanding of the world, shared with my partner Greg Pennoyer, my business partner as well. And they are sort of the points of the departure for what I'm going to talk about. The first one is the intensity of inquiry that Steiner's approach encourages or incites us to undertake. The question, what is going on here? What is going to happen here? Again, I've never actually read this in the original of Steiner, but somehow I associate it with Steiner. And it's something that Greg and I talked about a long time ago, alongside with, other ideas imbibed through osmosis or some other means, such as the conception of the entire Earth as a living organism, later on, amongst others, expressed as the Gaia theory, and then in its other variants, some would adhere more strongly to, which is derived from Goethe and Steiner. So the first one is about this inquiry, the idea, which is very inspiring, actually. I think that to really understand what we are doing as architects and urban designers in a place, it's surprising how rarely it's properly done. We see a lot of preparatory work that clients get us in to take further, and we realize that some very fundamental questions haven't been asked. And actually, I think all our work has been to do with trying to return at all times to first principles and re-chart that path and then see where that might take us. And so our work on healing environments, which still continues, because now everybody, what happens is, I'm sort of rambling now, by the way. What happens is that people learn the words, and it becomes official. So we all have to say healing environments. So everybody's doing healing environments. There is not a single architect in this country who's not designing a healing environment. Somehow they don't heal. And so it becomes a reflexive thing. And this frustrates me because actually, and now I'm really rambling, because I've been involved in the profession quite heavily. I was president of the RIBA, and a lot of my energies have now gone into not so much how our work can be better, but how work generally, how architecture, sustainability, interdisciplinary working, engineering, how can we make the world better? And there's a slight indulgence sometimes about being too focused on putting the world to rights rather than getting it right yourself, I confess. So, but that desire to put the world to rights I will run through, I'm afraid, this talk. And when I later on touch on Gandhi, it'll be very present. The second one of the ideas imbibed from Steiner is the idea that the process of design or solving something is not a process of adding one thing on top of the other, but actually of uncovering something which is already there. This is something that you feel in your bones as a designer. I think that very often we see a site or talk to the people who are going to use a building and understand the culture that they are adhering to or they want to move on from, and their ambitions. And then you get this feeling that there's something just waiting to be found. And what you need to do is to take things away to find it. Not that you start here and then you add a bit there to solve that problem, you add a bit there, this kind of additive thing. So the idea of subtraction to find the truth, in my understanding, resonates incredibly strongly with Steiner's views, and the idea that architecture can be law-giving, the idea that it is one of the ways to find a truth, and that is subtractive, it's not additive. And why that's important is that actually our entire processes, the very way we make buildings, is almost fundamentally additive, and it's kind of become more additive, and thereby it's very difficult to create wholeness through relentless addition. And in this next hour, I would like to speculate a bit more on those things. And in particular, when we go on to talk about Gandhi's hut, which I'm going to mention, because I realized entirely through how this talk arose that this was a building I accidentally mentioned to Richard in conversation, and realized that it's a building that's been through with me from literally birth, because I was born, well, I wasn't actually born there, I was a month old when I came back to where my parents were in Sevagram, which was the place where Gandhi had his centre through the crucial last 5 years, well, actually more like 10 years of the independence struggle. And this was a building I saw almost every day, and I sat in the prayer ground next to it, and it seeped in. And I'll tell you a little story about that. But one of the things that it makes me particularly wonder about, and again this comes back to Steiner, is if we are to strive for a balance between the spiritual and the physical, we have to actually confront a slightly difficult problem, which is that these aren't symmetrical. There's not a symmetrical condition. In a sense, although you can theoretically argue you can be too spiritual, I think that's not really the problem with the world. Whereas actually being too material and too materialistic is so obviously and profoundly an issue. And that leads to something quite awkward, especially for architecture and architects, which is that the idea of doing without, what can we do without, which is then a form of subtraction as well. And that's why it links with the subtractive process, or the revelatory process of uncovering the truth, and thereby actually to find strange riches. That this balance has to act upon us on a kind of daily basis in terms of making some pretty conscious decisions about what we are not going to do and what do we do without. And that's difficult. It's very difficult to communicate. And it's difficult to communicate in a world where equality is poorly understood, because it's obvious that there are some people you don't tell to do without, and there's there's huge danger in this being sort of a bourgeois indulgence. So I've kind of set the scene in this difficult conversation. So when I first talked to Richard, I was going to focus on how, despite all this problem with the current building processes and this additive process, which most of us practice, we do actually succeed from time to time at least in making buildings which have a genuine completeness and a wholeness about them. And I was going to illustrate that and talk about that. And I mentioned already that in the construction industry we talk about components, assemblies, packages, interfaces, interface management, the management of different subcontractors' packages. This is what we do in our office. We don't design really, we manage packages quite a lot. And so you won't know till the last minute maybe what some of the stuff looks like. It's because the contractor has obtained the lowest tender for handrails. If you actually believe that somehow handrails ought to have a relationship with the floor, which is possibly akin to that of a relationship of the base of a plant to the stem of a plant, then you've lost pretty much straight away, really. That's kind of a very long way from how package handling in the industry is working. And it's noticeable that in a lot of buildings today seem to be an apparently accidental coming together of manufacturers' catalogues. And that's kind of obvious to see everywhere. The specification, the NBS specification, becomes the building. And at its best, this process can be informed by the discovery of collage in modern art, and even the ideas of layering. And I think music is one of the greatest examples of an art form where layering, if there's an analogy between this and metamorphosis, I'm not clever enough to immediately spot it, but there is a kind of transition without seams. There's a kind of there's no line, which is quite clearly the divide. And that is really difficult to achieve, but in some hands it does actually succeed, maybe through the play of light or volumes and so on. But I'm disturbed by that gap that doesn't go away. It's very difficult to achieve real wholeness in this way. And, so for example, it's not the fact that Steiner's Goetheneum is a work of plastic art. It's concrete, cast and molded. In a way, the wholeness is almost inherent in that approach. And there is actually a trend now today, and I think I'm seeing this in architecture, where we are moving away from collage. There is a kind of impatience with the flimsiness of these assemblies, and people are creating buildings which are much more whole in that way. And I think there are some works emerging which are a return to that. And actually, it's interesting, some of that is a return to heavy as well, rather than a obsession which has been with light, with clothes. I happen to, because of Ted Cullinan's work, the idea of layers and, like samurai armor, like clothes, was very strong in Ted's work. That was his exploration. But I think that, in a sense, that exploration is at least temporarily at an end. I think that we are looking now, and it's there in his practices, or the successor practices work too. I think we're all, I'll be interested to hear from Peter what he thinks about this, that that those ideas are moving on to an idea of wholeness, which is much more like that you might intuit from Steiner. Now, my generation of architectural students, Peter was a year ahead of me at college, were introduced very powerfully to Darcy Thompson and On Growth and Form. But although we loved it, I don't think any of us managed to really build that into our design work, because it is very, very difficult. Actually, the idea that you can somehow understand the secrets of nature, and then somehow they can flow through you into the work, that's a pretty tall order. But apparently, people have been making things which are organic in name. They come out of the idea of what I think is a misunderstanding of organic, and even some people think Zaha Hadid's architecture is organic, or it gets that label, or it's naturalistic, and Calatrava, perhaps a more an equally interesting example. And what struck me about their work is, and again referring to the Steiner's work, and is it Ian who was talking about water just now? You were describing, you were using your hands, and you were talking about this world up here, which is the spiritual world and the world of ideas, which kind of manifests itself in physical realities. It's in Calatrava's work, it seems to me that there's a kind of a shortcut being taken, which is that you simply you try to, that's what it is, you try to arrive at the spiritual through imitating the material, rather than understand the material by going through the spiritual. So by imbibing the real principles, the real ideas in this realm, you might then produce something which is more genuinely organic, and I think that's the best organic architecture does, rather than by imitating the material manifestation of these ideas in nature. Now there is a movement called biomimicry, which on the face of it sounds like that, just like we're going to imitate natural forms, but in its best hands, and Michael Paulin and Exploration Architecture share our office. They, I believe, are genuinely, although much more in a scientific way, and they wouldn't acknowledge that it is spiritual, but I think that we can probably start thinking that spiritual and scientific are far from contradictory. And that very often we use the word spiritual to refer to a realm of ideas which have a power which is autonomous in some way. And Michael Paulin and company are beginning to understand genuinely how natural systems work, and they start with not form but systems. The idea, for example, that there is no waste in nature, that these are closed loops, they're regenerative loops. There's growth and decay, and then rebirth and regrowth and decay. And to actually build that in as a way of thinking about how you create buildings and so on. So they've just done a piece of work in Qatar where they are growing. There's a closed loop where desalination is done through solar power that then grows cucumbers, and the cucumbers, the aspiration from that then creates more energy in a complete closed loop. And you grow food in the desert, really, by directly using solar power, and some nutrients which are almost entirely present in the water anyway. So that seems to me to be getting somewhere really much more profound than Calatrava, let alone Zaha Hadid. I mean, I don't have anything against Zaha Hadid, by the way, other than she has too many cheap imitators, and it's a disaster for students to get hooked on that kind of stuff, because they become they kind of lose sight of what is real. Sorry, I should maybe acknowledge there are, of course, many non-architects in the audience. Zaha Hadid is one of our leading architects. She's responsible, the latest building being the Aquatic Centre in the Olympics, which, by the way, used 3,000 tons of steel to shelter 2,000 spectators, whereas the velodrome, which failed to get a Stirling Prize, sheltered 6,000 spectators with only 180 tons of steel. And I think that's significant. I think that in some ways, for me, that is that's not a million miles from the idea of an architecture in balance with the world and so on. So talking about some of these things to Richard, I mentioned somehow Gandhi's hut and this building that I was brought up with. And I remembered that I'd taken some photographs of this hut, which had turned out very, very well. And for my father's 80th birthday, I'd given him a set of prints, which he had loved very much. And they somehow captured, because the way the light was falling on that day and so on, something very extraordinary about this little building. And so I thought I would show you this building and share with you some speculations and thoughts that arise from seeing it. So let's have some lights. Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated in early 1947. My parents had already started working with him around 1944. My father was an art teacher and my mother was a nurse. And we lived in or they lived in Sevagram, which means the village of service that he'd founded in 1936. He had vowed never to go back to his original place in Gujarat, where he had his first ashram. Ashram being an abode of calmness, where the teacher or the guru traditionally would have his seat or base. And he'd vowed that until the British left India, he would never go back to Sabarmati Ashram, which is where he had his base. And he found this, the extraordinary strategist that he was. He uncannily selected a very small village, apparently remote, but within very easy reach of Wardha Junction, which is where the north-south railway line from Delhi to Madras intersects the one that goes all the way from Calcutta to Bombay. So he became absolutely, in one jump, much more close to the center of India, while still keeping his promise never to go back to his previous place. He put him much more in reach. And at times this little village felt like the capital of India in between 1942, where the big independence movement was launched, and 47, when independence was achieved. And so my parents lived there, I lived there. This is the prayer ground. The hut is, I think it's nice to have a bit of light in here, so please forgive the slightly fainter slides, is the one on the left. So I was brought up in this place, and it's a most fantastic childhood because you were genuinely in nature, in a community which pretty much lived in a closed loop system. To the extent that towards late 50s, the cow dung was all collected, put in a methane digester, and all the cooking in the community was powered by methane. The residue then made a very, very good compost. So taking methane out of dung doesn't actually affect its agricultural properties. So it is becoming more and more sophisticated in this way, and we had solar cookers. This is late 50s, early 60s. And I have no doubt that we took more carbon out of the atmosphere than we put in. The only fossil fuels that were burnt were paraffin for the hurricane lamps with which everybody saw their way between 6 and 9, 3 hours a day. That's all it was. I think everybody was in bed by then. They were up at the sunrise, and the whole lifestyle was like that. And there was a tiny bit of electricity. We didn't have electricity in our house, even in 1962 when we left to come to London from this place. And there was a cycle of annual rituals and harvests, and we were an agricultural community. It was primarily based on the idea of learning through doing. It was a school propounding Gandhi's ideas about basic education, in which all formal learning is rooted in the real processes needed to sustain life. So from an early age, you learned about everything. You learned about maths from weaving and so on. And of course from acreages and produce and food and weights and measures and all that. So it sounds wonderful, but of course it had a limited life. There were internal strife. I'm not trying to paint a utopian picture, although for a child it was the most incredible place. So at least every other day, I would be in this prayer ground, and we would have a interdenominational prayer, which included Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, all religions, in a tradition that continues, although there are now fewer and fewer people. And then I've been back several times, and I took these photographs, and the trouble is that as soon as I promised this, I started looking for these pictures, and they've disappeared. So I haven't got any of these lovely photographs left. So what I'm going to show you is what I've managed to get online and so on. So let me just describe this building. Next, then. This is actually one very old picture, about 1971, that I have left. It's obviously become a shrine, it's one of the most visited places now, and it's rather anomalous that thousands of people come and ogle at this extraordinarily tranquil place, which of course makes it untranquil. So next, please. It's a simple mud hut. It's basically wattle and daub. It comes straight out of the ground. It doesn't even have a plinth. It has a very small plinth, about this high, and a clay tile roof. The tiles are thrown by local potters. So cylinders are thrown and then cut in half. They're slightly tapering, which means that they can stack. So it's a very, very simple process. And all the buildings around there are made like that. Next, please. This is a view of it that was a winter picture. This is a summer picture, because these mats, which have vetiver in them, can be slid across on the windows and sprayed with water, and you get air-conditioned, as good as air conditioning inside. And again, for no energy. Next. So just some pictures and on. And this is, so we're sort of we're going around the building. This is actually the main entrance. And the next. So it's a really simple building, I'd say. You can find them in many villages in India. The extraordinary thing is that it was designed by an English woman called Madeline Slade, who was born into an aristocratic family. I think she had some musical background. She was a great devotee of Beethoven at the age of 15. She, I think, one way or another discovered Romain Rolland and went to visit him. And Rolland was at that point writing a biography of Mahatma Gandhi, and he gave her a copy to read, and she discovered her life mission. So she then, without telling Gandhi, learned to spin, learned to do all the things that were then being done in India, and she became one of his greatest confidants, assistants, and trusted lieutenants. And he renamed her Miraben, and Miraben, while in the very early days of Sevagram, built a hut for herself, which was this one, and then because Gandhi's original hut was getting overcrowded, she extended it and presented it to Gandhi, who initially said they were making too much fuss. But extraordinary, there was a complete fit between him and this place. Next. So this is an earlier picture of Miraben. And the next. So the interior of the hut is actually slightly different from what you would find in a traditional Indian hut like this. It shares a huge amount, of course. It's made out of the same materials. It has, it shares some of the very simple planning principles, which actually have now become enshrined in the word bungalow. The word bungalow comes from Bangla, and Bangla comes from Bengal. And the bungalow was a name given by the British to the huts they first made for themselves, based on the Bengali hut. So the bungalow is now a worldwide typology, but it comes from Bengal. And the same cottage, if you ask a child in India to draw the cottage, they will draw the same thing. They'll draw a version of this building. The difference is that there are some little touches inside this building that make it different. And actually, it's quite difficult to know what they are. Next, please. It's difficult to know what they are, other than that it's very lofty, it's taller. There are, the Om, the figure above the sitting place on the left. There are small decorations like that. The window disposition is interesting. There's some really low windows, some high windows, as if somebody has really thought about what the relationship between inside and outside might be. Traditionally, in an Indian building, you don't really connect inside and outside. That's because the outside is where you live. You only come inside for very few functions, and everything is multifunctional. But this is a building in which there seem to be some connections made. And the next. And the most famous place is where Gandhi used to sit every day and do his work. By this time, he was 69, he was 70, he was over 70, 75. He died just before he was 80. And it's been kept exactly as it was on the last day he left. So this is exactly how it was. And the next. And this is one of the windows, and there's impacted in it, just out of the mud, these few just pieces of work. Nobody really knows whether it was Mirabean who asked for them or the craftsman did it himself. And the next. But there is a constant feeling about it. This is probably the first time that anybody has seen Gandhi's toilet in a public lecture. But there is a sense of it growing out of the ground as plinths, as surface, without a transition which is abrupt or sudden, other than the parasol of the roof. It's only two things. The thing grows out of the ground, it's a parasol of the roof. Next. And then around the other side, there is the office, which is much more brightly lit, which is where the pictures I took were, and the sun comes in, and there's some absolutely magical atmosphere inside. And the next. And next. And this I just put in because this is the house we lived in, which was built a bit later. And actually, I think that's my mother, and I'm probably in the pram. And the next, which is the last one. And this is just a fan hanging next to the window. This is a building which has incredibly little in it. There's almost nothing there. Just a few objects, and they're made all the more intense for being just so few things. So you sort of linger on everything that's there. And of course, what this represents is, what you might call a philosophy of poverty, an embrace of poverty as a way of stripping away the unnecessary, to stick to your needs only, and to thereby enrich your life. This paradox that through poverty you enrich. And this is very much what Gandhi believed in. And of course it's there in virtually all religions, the philosophy of poverty. And even Proudhon wrote about it, but from an economic point of view. And it made me wonder, first of all, why did this building become so important, apart from the very obvious answer that it was Gandhi's hut? You might say, oh, job done, that's why. And it's Gandhi's hut, so it's got to be incredibly important. And can you take, can you go beyond that? Why did it fit Gandhi so well? Because he didn't do anything to it. He just occupied it. He was not an art lover by any manner of means at all. He was almost the reverse. Because my father was an art teacher, when he went to India, to Sevagram first, Gandhi gave him a kind of a scolding, about what real art was. Real art is learning how to sweep the floor. That's as much of, that is real art. What you're doing is fine, carry on, but until you learn to sweep the floor, you're not an artist. So, and he didn't have any time for art in the sense that my father wanted to develop, which he developed hugely with, and made it part of a philosophy which held that if people appreciated art from school days onwards, from a very young age onwards, that we would have a more harmonious world. We would have a world much more in balance. And he genuinely believed, because he was a pacifist, practiced non-violence. He came to the UK to be the general secretary of a pacifist organization. He thought that the path to that was actually through everybody learning art, and that he very much believed in Kumaraswamy's famous saying that an artist isn't a special kind of man, but every man is a special kind of artist. And every person is a special kind of artist. And he passionately believed in that. Now, Gandhi didn't believe that. actually I think it's quite hard for politicians to really appreciate art. There seems to be a phenomenon that politicians don't get art. It must be a natural law. And nevertheless, this building has become what it has. So in the early 90s, a whole generation of young architects in India somehow rallied around the idea of this building and produced a book. A journalist has summarized this in a book, Bapu Kuti, which means Bapu is Gandhi's affectionate name, father, Kuti is hut. And it has become emblematic of a new kind of organic architecture, not having been designed by an architect, actually having almost been an accident, been lying there neglected by the whole architectural world throughout the building of Chandigarh and Le Corbusier and Louis Kahn, and nobody ever mentioned this. And of course that's probably why they adopted it, because it is the antidote to all of that era of heroic modernism. But they have, and from that has spun quite a lot of work with bamboo, with mud, and it has inspired now a generation of architects to do new work. And all of them, however, are united in the idea that we have to give up all this steel and glass, and have to give up the bounty of the post-industrial world. And so my question is, what do we have to give up? Is this difficult issue in this balance between the spiritual and the material? If we are to create a sustainable world living within the closed system of the planet, do we actually give up? And in that, can we turn the language around so it's not giving up? So it's actually a path to an enrichment rather than poverty. How do you avoid the idea that you are just a hair shirt revolutionary? You are telling people to do without things that they like and they love. So much of the population is not on the same page as those of us who might be attracted to this idea. So how do we go there? And is there any merit in the idea that we can only go there through a new kind of education? And in that respect, and coming back to wholeness, one of the ideas that I feel strongly is that the appreciation of the natural world and space and a strong spatial understanding is something that we are born with, and that education generally covers it up and erases it or conceals it. It doesn't erase it, actually. I think it covers it up. Watching my children grow up, I know that from a very early childhood they were intensely aware of the rooms they were in. When they played under the A-frame clothes rack and made their huts underneath it, that this wasn't some accidental discovery. It was maybe an accidental discovery, but it was teleological. It has purpose, and all of them did that. My oldest son is particularly spatially adventurous, and we were still building our house, and we had all the doors off the kitchen units, and he managed to crawl behind all the dishes and went from one end of the kitchen to the other along the water pipes, exploring this whole labyrinth. And eventually he pushed all the crockery out of the cupboard and landed in a heap with broken glass all around him, but completely unscathed. And I think that what he was doing resonates with me very much as an architect. And I see an analogy between the point I started about wholeness being something waiting to be discovered, with the idea that actually these sensibilities are already in us, and we cover them up, and we have to uncover or subtract to rediscover those things. Thank you.